Welcome back to the X Podcast. You are listening to the voice of Russ Moore, sitting across the table from Tim Moore, adjacent to Jesse James McCoy.
Hey.
How are you?
Wait, your middle name isn't Jesse, is it? I mean,
James?
James.
It is not.
Sorry.
That's a famous gunslinger.
I'm familiar with who Jesse James is. I just didn't know if that was actually
Did
your
you know
middle
there's
name.
another famous Jesse James?
Yes.
Yes,
Coast
there
Choppers.
is.
Yes.
Yep. West Coast
I was
Choppers.
thinking about somebody else.
Who are you thinking
There's, I believe she's a singer. She's mildly attractive.
Oh, yes. There is that
Mildly
Jesse James,
attractive.
too.
Jesse James Decker,
Yep.
isn't that right?
Sure.
There is a singer.
Yeah.
But
No, but James is
the one
not
I
my
thought
middle
about
name.
was the West Coast Chopper guy that you're thinking
That's
of.
how I usually think of
Okay. None of those, but we
No.
have the world famous,
Yes.
locally
And
speaking.
And I'll explain.
Locally world famous.
Yes,
Locally world famous. Here's where I'm gonna put my fearless co-host on the spot. There was a just off the press blazing trend while you were on break of hot topics that me, Jesse James McCoy, and Zach Toes in the Sand Brown did. We did 3 of them. They were
Toes in the sand.
They were what was it? What do we call them? Hot takes. Hot takes. Did you ever listen to them?
I listened to part of it. I didn't finish the one.
Part
but I
of it. We did 3.
I listened to part of them. I listened to one of them, and I didn't listen to
Okay.
all of them. They're great, though.
How's that
one
make you
was great.
feel? How's that make you feel?
Hey, you know what? He was on sabbatical.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
I didn't listen to
All right.
any of that stuff while I was on sabbatical.
So Jesse James is back.
Wait a
for-
minute. Are we going to do hot takes?
At some point, we should.
Okay, then
Absolutely.
I'm going to save this one that I've written down.
Yeah,
I wrote
save-
one
save
down.
it,
I'm going to
save
save
it,
it.
save it,
I'm going to save it because I've got.
We
I've
need
got
to
a hot
have
take.
one. We need to bring an extra seat, and the 4 of us just do.
Wait, who was the
Zach Brown.
Zach was on the. Was he on all of them? You guys did the same
Yep.
ones. I didn't know if you changed it. So
Nope. So we need to do one with the 4 of us. That'd be fun.
Let's do it.
Jesse's here. He doesn't need a reason to be here. He is a fan favorite. But I'm going to tell you one of the specific reasons he's here for this one in a minute. A couple weeks ago, we started kind of maybe a higher level conversation around the power of words. We've done a ton of podcasts around the power of the words that you speak. You know, there's no shortage of books out about the power of words. Scripture says in Proverbs, the power of life and death is in the tongue. We all know the power of words. Words can ruin your day. Words can make your month. Someone can speak a word destructive enough to stick with you for life. And so we know the power of words, but we kind of tried to elevate that not just to the power of the words you choose, but to the power of the language you use, with the understanding that the language, kind of like, and ton of gritty examples. There's a lot of funny videos right now about office jargon. EOD, circle back, brass tacks. We're gonna ping back. There's, then of course listening to you in IT world, and we go into the Tolkien language of hyperdecks and embedded supernovas. But and then medical fields, you listen to people in hospitals. They talk like it's normal with a ton of abbreviations and made up words, and you're just like, I don't know what any of that means. All of that is okay in certain contexts, as long as that quote-unquote code language, there's an understanding and agreement of what it means, A, and B, that it's used for efficiency and not for attack or agenda. And so we started a conversation on how important is it in everyday life to pay attention to the hidden meanings, narratives, power behind the words and language we choose. And we started with God speak, God language. And we talked about what's the power of God language. It's funny, I was going to read it. Right after we did that, I came across this verse in the message, 2 Corinthians 4, where Paul literally said, we don't twist God's word to suit ourselves. And I was like, I wish I had that when we did ours.
Yeah.
And it was funny because we got done with our podcast, and me and you both were like, I don't know if that helped or made any sense, but the feedback has been really good that I think it struck a chord. I actually thought of one funny other phrase. This is something I heard old TD Jake say 10 years ago in a message. You ever heard somebody, and I say this, like I've been struggling with something, And I think it's an acceptable thing to say and to use.
Yeah.
But I heard T.D. Jakes joke in a message one time. He said, when we say we're struggling with something, that's what Christians say when what they mean is I'm still doing it. And I was like, dang.
It's pretty true.
Yeah.
So, anyways. All right. So, we did the power of language when it comes to our faith. What I wanted to have a conversation about was the power of language when it comes to our relationships. And a couple of years ago, I think I told you, Jesse James, that I started to get uncomfortable as much as I love the fact that it's become normative to go to counseling, go to therapy, go to professionals. I think that's an amazing thing. We talk about it openly here. We did a series about it. But I started becoming uncomfortable a few years ago. The more I heard people overusing, and in my view, misusing pop psychology terms. And then we've, I think, done a few podcasts about it. I think we brought it up to Dr. West. But I was shocked when about a month ago, I actually finally saw secular articles start coming out about the danger and the limits of therapy speak. And so I know me and you talked about it, but I also know your job, you work with Next Gen. So you work not just with a ton of people your age, but you work with middle schoolers, high schoolers, you lead people that lead kids. So I know that you are inundated with this, and I'm just curious, you have any thoughts?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. Just want to jump right in.
Just jump right in.
That's it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's an important conversation to have because there's kind of two sides of it. Is obviously in the last 10, 20 years, there's been much more of a cultural acceptance of, hey, let's talk about mental health. Let's talk about the struggles we all have. But with anything, the pendulum can swing too far the other way to where now we are using really heavy terms like trauma, gaslighting, all this stuff for everyday interactions in our relationships.
Yeah.
To where, man, I'm just gaslit everywhere I go. Like, no, it's not really how it works. It's sort of like, we've been given words that almost like, you can't just diagnose yourself with some medical kind of condition, but we've all taken this stance of we can diagnose psychological issues. Like, they're a narcissist. It's like, do you actually have the authority to claim that or know that or actually use that term? So, I think just my first thought is, we've been given tools we don't know how to wield. I think for most of us.
That's good. Have you seen from your seat a definitive uptick in the use of this?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah,
100%.
Just in the last few years, or just
like, yeah, I mean,
Do you mean like an actual 100%, or are you just using the phrase 100%?
no, 100%. Actually, 102.4.
102. Okay, it's doubled.
No, but like, it happened this week. In middle school, they were talking about, oh, I have this trauma, right? And so you don't like when it's a 13-year-old.
How do you approach that?
It's
Wait.
like,
What was the? Can we state what the middle school person's trauma was? Or would it be too
well, I
personal?
don't know.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right. like-
But when you hear a
So it
middle
could have
schooler
been a
say
real
that,
one.
The reality is,
But I mean, it
is
could be like
really
it could be like I got disciplined and I'm not allowed to play Xbox for
Exactly.
a week, and
Exactly.
I got this trauma in my life.
In my experience, it's usually that. Oh man, my parents are they're just horrible. They're abusive. Like, what
Yeah.
they do? They took my phone away. I'm like,
Yeah, it's like that's not abuse.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too specific. I think that was that word that you just used was the first time I got really concerned because I heard somebody throw that around, and I was in kind of a mediating moment, and I stopped because I didn't know all the details, and I said, "Hey, so when you say abusive, like, what happened?"
Yeah.
Because I want to know. I didn't want to make assumptions either way because either way could be dangerous. The last thing you want to do is to minimize or disregard someone that's been abused. But at the same time, that word has power, accusatory, destructive power, if it's not true. And so I asked this person, and the more they described it, I'm like, wait, so you were not physically abused? No, well, no. And so explain, like, okay, what happened? And then, again, I'm not a psychologist, but my understanding of the word is I was like, oh, I don't even know if there was emotional or verbal abuse. And I was like, oh, wow, we're in a minefield in this cultural moment.
yeah.
And then you shared that you said that
Okay.
Laura Lee had said you were gaslighting
Here
her
it
at
is.
dinner.
Here it goes.
The other,
This is that thing we talked about on the podcast where people could know that you're lying. Okay. I think what we have is I think you kind of highlighted what we've seen in culture, which is an acceptance of the psychology world when it comes to our mental health and our experiences. What has come out of that is a whole lot of people armed with weapons they don't realize what they're armed with. And so, especially right now, I mean, there is, if you follow the news, there are a whole lot of accusations they're always coming out about abuse, about other things, and some of them are just awful sounding and tragic. But we also live in a time where just the accusation alone carries so much weight that for people don't realize, I think sometimes, that to throw around these terms, you can destroy someone's life when it's not true.
Yeah.
You throw out the term of, he was abusive to me, she was abusive to me, or a kid wants to just throw out, say, my parents are so abusive toward me, blah, blah, blah. And somebody just hears a little piece of that. Well, next thing you know, they're calling children's services because they feel like they have a duty to report, and they heard this kid talking about their parents being abusive and didn't get the context. And the fact was that they disciplined them because they did not do any of their assignments at work, and they got an F in their class, and they, whatever.
Yeah.
And so they basically said, you can't go anywhere for a week.
Yeah.
Or doing it, or get on my phone. And next thing you know, you got child services showing up at the door, investigating, maybe taking the kids out, And so I think we just have to understand we live in a time, in a cultural moment where just an accusation carries so much weight.
Yeah.
Even if legally it doesn't pan out, or maybe something didn't, we also know that just an accusation alone is enough to ruin people.
Yeah. What was it? We've probably talked about this before, but was it the comedian Bill Burr that said his belief is that they should not be able to ever publicize an accusation, only a conviction.
Yeah.
Which I actually think would be an incredible idea.
Yeah.
Because I think there's just so much danger.
I think one of the fears that some people have is that whether or not the way our justice system is set up, that it would be like you could have somebody, I'll give you an example, you could have somebody, and I've read stories of like abusers in colleges, male abusers in colleges have taken advantage of women and other things, that nothing's happened to them, even when they did speak up, and cases getting thrown out because either someone knows somebody or because they're bad evidence. And so some people would say, I agree with you in one sense. Another side of that, some people would say is, but I would want to warn anybody that was potentially around this person just because the court system didn't side with, or wouldn't even admit certain evidence that end up being not a conviction.
No, that's true.
I mean, so there's a
and I think anybody should be allowed to say whatever they want to say legally. But I guess his point was the media shouldn't publicize something that's just speculation. And there could be argument right now that while what you're saying is very true, I don't know if current momentum is going the other way or not. Sure, currently. But anyways, that's a side trail. We can get into all the dangers of therapy speak in a moment. Why don't we go ahead and first look at some of the words? I mean, you mentioned a few of them. And I don't expect anybody at this table to have memorized the Webster definition of all these, but gaslighting, what does that mean? Why are you laughing?
I remember it was not that long ago. You and I were talking, you're like, I think it's been too long. I'm not really sure what that term means, but it's been too long. I can't ask anymore.
That's very true. You got a serious look.
Oh, sorry. I was just, I wasn't in this conversation, so it's not as funny to me.
You probably do have the Websters.
Yeah, you probably do.
No, I don't, but I have something in front of me, but it's not that. So go
let's
ahead.
hear it.
No, let's go. It says gaslighting, or the experience of being manipulated into doubting your feelings and perceptions of reality.
Yes, that's right. So basically, if someone, an example would be if somebody tells you how they feel, and you somehow turn that back around to make them feel crazy for feeling that.
Yeah.
You invalidate their feelings. You turn it back around. That would be an example of gaslighting.
Usually, I think, and most people understand this in relationships, I think it's also where you say certain things that it's like throwing gas on the fire. right? That's a simplistic way of understanding. I think gaslighting is
I don't think that's it.
the idea is that you're actually you can cause more harm and damage by the
I see what
language
you're
that you
saying.
use.
Okay.
I'm using that as an analogy based on the words, but
Okay.
it's the idea of you're not only just dismissive, but you can also you're
By
you're
being
pushing
dismissive,
it,
yeah.
you're
Making it
that's
worse.
yes,
Yeah.
that's
That's what
kind
you're
of the
saying.
idea of
Yeah. So there's gaslight. There's how about this one? Toxic.
yeah.
You know, it's interesting. As we talked about what we were doing, somebody was in here about to leave who has very young kids, elementary school kids, and was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad y'all are doing this." She was like, "I hear my elementary school kids use this. Like, oh, this is being toxic."
Yeah.
And so I don't have maybe
That one's almost become a slang term too. Like, it's not just like toxic in the, mental health field, but it's just like when you're being annoying. Oh, you're being so toxic. Like it's become a slang
become
term.
yeah.
So that's interesting. You got one generation who's saying that to their parents, and they mean it not in that other sense, but the parents going, "I'm not being toxic."
Yeah. Which again, this may be a lack of preparation on our part, but I would assume the connotation of toxic in the clinical sense is when something is so dysfunctional, a relationship or a context or a home is so dysfunctional that it becomes harmful.
Yeah.
Manipulative, dangerous, destructive. Another one would be abuse. So again, we know there's different layers of abuse. There's verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. But in the clinical sense, it carries a very extreme definition to it of what abuse means. But I mean, what would be an example of where you hear that more in a flippant term?
Abuse. I mean, when it comes to any relationship that's broken up, usually one of the parties says, "Well, you know what? They were just abusive. They were emotionally abusive." When in reality, I mean, maybe they were.
Yeah.
But maybe in reality, you just didn't agree on everything.
Yeah. Maybe you got in
And
some
their
heated arguments.
differing opinion felt so threatening that you labeled it abuse.
Okay, so
We hear this with church.
Yeah. Well, okay. So maybe what would be helpful, again, we live in the world of we live in a social experiment called the church community, and we spend a lot of our time dealing with challenging situations at times through pastoral counseling and other things like that, but we're not therapists. But I do think it'd be good for us to flesh out some of this because I think that's the problem is the vagueness for which these terms are being thrown out is what can cause damage, not only in a relationship, but maybe to someone's character or their reputation or whatever. And so, like, I think a good one is you could pause on abuse or whatever and say, what's a good way to clearly delineate from something that is actual abuse versus I didn't like the way that conversation made me feel.
So because this is so important, Google definition of abuse is to treat a person or an animal with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly.
Right. And so let's just at least recognize that culturally speaking, going back, I'm going to go back, let's go back in the last century. Abuse was almost always reserved as a term for physical violence. That has changed over the last couple decades. There is other, and that's not the only version. Let me just say that. But typically, if someone says, "Oh, they were abusive," my guess is the first thing that all of us probably think of is physically abusive. There are other levels of abuse. We see emotional abuse. Well, how would you guys describe emotional abuse? I've got about 3 or 4 in my head that I can go through and think of forms of abuse.
Yeah.
But what's a type of emotional abuse that you guys would say? Like, how does somebody know in a relationship that actually someone is being emotionally abusive versus you're getting into arguments and fights all the time?
Yeah, it's so hard. I feel like I need 1,000 disclaimers. I'm not a therapist.
Sounds like you are.
I'm not a therapist at all.
Trying to be.
Okay, well, you asked the question, so who's at fault here? I feel like you're gaslighting me, Tim.
My.
Sorry. Touche. I think when I personally hear someone was being emotionally abusive, I think of someone who is regularly being cussed out and spoken to in a way that regularly, repeatedly destroys their self-esteem. They're being called derogatory names, profanity, They're being, I think of those situations you hear of when someone is manipulative and uses words to basically trap people into thinking they can never leave. No one will ever love you. You know the reason that, like you hear those kind of stories.
It's always your fault.
It's always your fault. Like, you're a horrible person. Like, no one wants you. You're worthless. You demeaning words that steal people's worth on a regular basis, I think of as emotional abuse.
Yeah.
I don't think of arguments, even heated arguments
Right.
or disagreements, as abuse.
Yeah. I also would say that a parent disciplining their kid is not emotional abuse. Now, that doesn't mean that a parent can't cross a line. We know that exists into some forms of abuse.
Yes.
But I mean, like, that's an interesting one of as a parent. I think every parent tries,
Yes.
hopefully, good parents I know. To me, there's a difference between punishing or disciplining your kid because they did something based on their behavior, and you're giving a punishment or discipline that's appropriate to it, versus tearing your kid down. And I would say that emotional abuse, I would say, and again, I don't know if there's much differentiation between emotional abuse and verbal abuse. I think they kind of go a little bit hand in hand. I think emotional abuse, verbal abuse is just probably getting cussed at, just getting, someone's just ripping you apart with their words. I think emotional abuse probably, number one, it's using your words, but it's way deeper. As you said, I think it speaks to someone's value, their esteem. I think it dehumanizes someone. I think it, like you said, the kind of people, and one of the things that is common with abuse stories, actual abusers, is that when people are abused, either physically, emotionally, verbally, sexually, it tends to reason a lot of them feel like they can't get out. There's the manipulation portion of it has a hold on them, and so there's isolating them from their families. There's basically telling them, you'll be nothing without me. You'll never survive without me. All these kind of things that really create a dependency, even in a really dangerous and hostile environment.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably some of what we're talking about. The challenge is that relationships and how they operate work really on a spectrum, right? There's some healthy relationships. We have people that can communicate really well when they're dealing with a problem, to people that their emotional intelligence is so low that they don't have a self-awareness, that they don't, that they just rip apart, they blame, they do everything else, and to the point where it becomes abusive. And I think because it's a spectrum, it's really hard to sometimes find that line.
Yeah, and that's
go,
where
here's the line, that's actual abuse. Like you said, a really hard conversation or one where it gets heated doesn't necessarily equate to emotional abuse.
Well, and I think that's where not only is accuracy important, and that's where professionals, and like the article we were looking at talked about the importance of therapy speak should be limited to being used by therapists. Because let's be honest, one of the things, I want to be so gentle as I say this, but because there's people that may be listening or watching that you've experienced this, but it can't be overstated how imperfect the church has been over the centuries. And there are plenty in the past and present examples of people who have actually experienced abuse from the church.
Spiritual abuse.
And spiritual abuse, church hurt, which those are two very different things. And the damage can be catastrophic. People walk away from the faith. People, it just is. And there should be nothing but empathy and acknowledgement of that, and healing and love towards that. At the same time, I've seen this. I've watched people that have genuinely experienced, from my perspective, vantage point, abuse, and then I've seen other people that I was part of the conversations they would later reference, where they just simply got offended and left, and then I heard them later on refer to, I was abused. There's a lady right now, you probably heard of her. We talk about Jacob Salguero. He's this Instagram influencer right now, speaking to Gen Z. There's this other lady that's just blown up in popularity over the last 2 years, Natalie. I'm trying to remember her last name, but she was raised in church, actually went through legitimate church hurt, has come back around, and she has this really famous Instagram handle called Raised to Stay. And she actually just came, what I'm talking about? She actually just released a book. And she has a very interesting and I think important niche right now, where she's speaking both love and healing to people who've experienced church hurt, but then also tough love to people who are using it as an excuse to throw stones or leave the church and become bitter. And she has this one really famous post that went viral, and the first part of the slide was, church accountability is not abuse. and
Spiritual accountability is not abuse.
And
Have that note.
yeah. Riff on that.
Yeah, no, I just think one of the dangers, especially with younger generations, is obviously part of the role of the church is to surround younger people with older, more mature people that can hold them accountable to their actions. Say, hey, this is not the right way to live. I want to protect you from harm further down the road, and I'm going to stop you in your path right now. But when you think you are in a place to diagnose gaslighting, and when somebody puts your own behavior in front of you and says, this is not a right way to live, and it makes you feel guilt, you now have the weapon to say, oh, that made you're making me seem crazy, or you're making me seem like I'm wrong, or I'm bad, or I'm this. Instead of saying, you know what, maybe that was a terrible decision, you now have the crutch or the you can hide behind, oh, they just gaslit me. It's like the reality of, I think most people, not most is, I don't know, maybe most people that say, oh, I was gaslit by the church. Maybe you were. That's definitely possible. Maybe you were just held accountable and you didn't like the way it made you feel.
Yeah.
Or you had a disagreement.
I think this is a big enough concept, like the whole idea of spiritual abuse and church hurt, that it might be helpful if we could just talk through, maybe if you guys would think about it, what are some scenarios, again, like I'm trying to define, what are some scenarios that you've either heard of, maybe you haven't experienced yourself or experienced, that you would say, this I agree with is spiritual abuse versus, or, you know, because I think we've been around enough that anybody who leaves a church because they get offended is so quick to turn around and say, I was hurt by that church. And my experience has been, when I talk to people, again, this is my experience, and I know that there's real church hurt out there. I know it's a real thing. But I'm going to say something that's probably not going to be popular if you've been church hurt. And when I say you are, you know, almost everybody seems to think they're church hurt because they left a church because they got offended because of something was said or something they weren't allowed to do, or they didn't get invited to be on this team, or they didn't whatever. And that is, my perspective has been in pastoring for 20 years and talking to a lot of people who say they've come from other places and been hurt. And then what I've seen of people leave and say they've been hurt, and like you said, having intimate knowledge of the conversations that happened, that those people have left and said that they've been hurt by the church, it's a really, really small percentage of people that I have seen and know of their experiences and leaving that actually would have a credible thing to say of being abused or hurt by a church.
Yeah.
And it's hard because I think that's, again, I understand my perspective is my seat's going to be different. If you're someone who attends a church, but I've just seen over and over that whenever leaders try to lead, again, leverage, this is the challenge we have in the faith where Scripture is our ultimate authority, and as pastors, we just try to operate by what Scripture says.
Yeah.
But in doing so, it really sometimes puts a situation where people will get mad, they get offended. You know, we've had people, for example, in leadership roles, not on staff, but in like volunteer leadership roles where they're leading a team of people, doing other kind of stuff, that we find out that they're living in a way that is just antithetical to the Christian life and what we would expect for someone in leadership. We had somebody years ago, I remember, that we came and we had to sit her down from leading a team, volunteer team. And we told her why, and it was because of lots and lots of people reporting back to her things that she was doing, not married, with somebody else from the team, staying over the night, all this kind of stuff. Basically a relationship, a very intimate relationship had developed in there. And you would have thought that we just took her out and flogged her. I mean, I understand that she was, but again, this is one of the situations of, I just want people to understand what we do. This is one of the situations of people leave angry, mad, how dare you come at me? I'm sure you have, I heard that, I'm sure you've got things that what if you had to have that exposed? Then all in this meeting, I'm going, we weren't telling you couldn't serve. We weren't telling you we hate you. We weren't saying, we're just saying, this has come to light. Do you own this? To, just we need you to step down from leading, not from serving, not from this, but we need to help address this because being in a role of leadership just requires more. And those are the kind of, that's just one scenario of situations that we've had, real one, where people, I've been hurt by the church. I know there are situations where people have been hurt because there have been bad leaders in the church all the way around.
Yeah.
And I haven't done everything right. I get that. If I know, I'll go back to somebody to try to own it. But my goodness, the amount of people that say they've been hurt by a church because they didn't get their way or what they hoped would happen is high, in my opinion.
Well, and I think part of the danger is, what you said in the beginning of, even just an accusation is so dangerous in our culture, especially when you have these words like trauma, abuse, that it almost makes it so like if somebody were to throw that on you and they use those big mental health language, like there's almost nothing you can say in response.
I know.
Yeah.
It's like it takes all the wind out of any argument you could have to defend yourself or have any counterpoint. It's just, then you're just invalidating their experience.
I'll go so far as to say, and I'm trying to be very careful with what I say, we've had former staff members that when they leave, whether it's being fired or they quit, would literally post publicly about our church, abuse, this and that, only to a year later come back and go, I apologize, I should have never said that, I was in the right place. Yeah. Okay, I will gladly accept, and I don't have beef with you, but don't think for 1 second you throwing around all those terms on social media and other things did not put some type of damage on what people think about that church, even if you come back around and go, I was wrong.
Yeah, that's actually kind of skip ahead to something I was going to say at the end. This may be an unpopular opinion. That's almost why, for me, I don't even think it's necessarily healthy to have those words in your vocabulary. I actually think those words are helpful if you are, because it's just so, this is such a delicate line to walk, because what I don't want to ever come across as is a lack of empathy towards people. There is something so tender and sensitive and special but dangerous about a spiritual community because you connect to the most intimate level. This is why David, in the Psalm said, I could have handled it if my enemies had attacked me, but it was my brother. When you connect at a spiritual level, there's something so special. And that is why the weight that we carry, and like you, I've made plenty of mistakes. Oh my gosh.
Well,
and that's why I just always want to have empathy towards people that are struggling or have been genuinely broken or hurt. And I also understand that part of the way you respond to church hurt has to do with the level of spiritual maturity you're at. I think, because for me, I can look back on seasons, and I won't go in detail, but I can look back on seasons a long time ago where, oh my gosh, I could claim a lot of church hurt where I had a leader over me and what I felt like was a heavy, heavy betrayal. But for me, I guess I was fortunate enough I expect that. I expect that even in a community of faith, it's made of human beings, broken human beings. And at some point, there's going to be disagreements, brokenness. At some point, I'm going to be mistreated. Other times, I'm going to unintentionally mistreat and have to come back and apologize myself. I expect that in a community of faith. And I can experience hurt without saying, oh, that's Jesus' fault or the church's fault. No, that's me and another broken human being.
Yeah.
And I love what somebody once said. They said, the crazy irony is it's in the church that you're wounded, but it's also in the church that you're healed. And so I do think this is why for me, I'm like, okay, this language in my view is powerful and helpful when you are actually with a therapist and they're actually helping you address genuine wounds for your healing, but not so that I can stay a victim or use my own language to attack.
Yeah.
I
think it's important just to kind of clarify, because I think in the church world, the term spiritual abuse is again, it's one of these, it's taking a pop psychology kind of reference today. I know abuse has always been around, but I'm just saying the way we understand it culturally has been redefined. And then attaching spiritual environment to it and spiritual leadership to it. And now I feel like it runs the gamut. It could be that you had a spiritual leader that, like we've said before, that one of the things that we do is we just try to hold Scripture up, not as someone who's perfect. And even Scripture tells us that when you see someone sinning, go to them and try to restore them gently. I feel like it's one thing we've always tried to do. Like, and I understand that there are leaders out there that are toxic. There are leaders out there that probably don't do that. But the majority of the pastors I've met do not come across that way to me. But what I know of when I talk to them, other pastors, is that when somebody doesn't, when there's a pastor that says the way you're living does not line up with Scripture, therefore Scripture defines that as sin, and you need to repent of that. There's people that go, that's spiritual abuse.
That's not where I usually see it, though.
I'm telling you, though, but that is. I'm saying this is one of the versions of what people sometimes may say, and I'm trying to say is not spiritual. I'm trying to define what isn't and what is spiritual abuse, because spiritual abuse is the idea of using spiritual authority, using spiritual position to try to control or manipulate.
Yes.
That's spiritual abuse.
Yes.
And that is probably some of the worst. Next to physical, I agree. I think spiritual abuse is awful.
And I think probably, and I want to pivot soon because I want to
get back into relationships.
But I do think that this is, maybe this is for another podcast. We had a podcast a few years ago where we talked about, because this is kind of another word that's more of a cultural hot button than it is maybe therapists speak, but is cult.
Yeah.
People get mad at churches, they call it a cult. Well, a cult, you can't disagree. A cult, you worship the leader, and a cult, you can't leave. So if anything, we're an anti-cult, because you can believe whatever the heck you want to. We have very open feedback loops, and you can leave whenever the heck you want to.
Yeah.
So we're almost like an anti-cult.
Yeah.
But the root word of culture is cult, and so it's weird. I think one of the tough things on this broken planet is a lot of times if you have a strong culture that's by intentionality, you have parallel tendencies of what the shadow side would be a cult. I think the same thing it just is what came to mind when you're talking about spiritual manipulation or abuse is where you're trying to control or manipulate. I think what's tough is if you have a really strong leader, the shadow side of that is that can walk really close to what someone could interpret as you're persuading / manipulating.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's a whole other can of worms we could open later. But I want to pivot back. I want to look at, because I sent you the article. Why? Here's maybe just one place to just hit real quick. Why is using these terms appealing? Just even in everyday life, why is using pop psychology terms? Why is it appealing to us?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think it's given us words that validate and justify every thought or feeling we have. If I can paint with such extreme language that it makes it seem like I'm right, then I don't have to change. I don't have to address any of my issues. I also think that
it's like it gives you an immediate moral high ground.
Yeah, you're always right. And I think it also has the ability to make it seem like you are the victim in every situation.
Yeah.
I think it's very thinly veiled victim mindset. Because a victim can take no ownership. A victim has no control. And so if I can use these terms like abuse, trauma, neglect, gaslighting, whatever, then I have no blame. I have no fault. I've been treated poorly, and I think it gives us maybe permission to wallow in self-pity.
No, that's good. That's really good. Yeah. I don't know if there's more to add to that. You have anything?
No, I mean, I think what he said is it validates how I feel, and we just have to recognize that how we feel in relational conflict is not always right.
Yep.
But we always, I mean, let's face it, we're we're pretty sure we're always right.
Yeah.
In every argument, everything. I've been married a long time. I understand what it feels like to always think you're right in every conversation, and even drop the ones that you don't feel like fighting about, but still you're pretty sure you're right. You know, and so I also think that, I'll just add to this, I think people go to that extreme language when they're losing.
I think it's true. Yeah.
When you don't have a whole lot of ground to stand on, like I feel like the hardest arguments that I've had have been when the other person, whether it's my wife and other stuff, where they've got a lot of evidence. You know what I mean? Like, no, you said this and then you did that.
Well, you're just a you're a narcissist. You know what I mean?
And so I think,
Which that'd be hilarious if anybody ever accused Laura Lee of being a narcissist.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't happen. But I think that sometimes when we're losing or we don't have the vocabulary to, I think sometimes people may use it in, let's face it, there are some people who are better arguing than others. And so some people maybe feel like they can't, you know, the other person's winning the argument. And so, you know, I think that the temptation is to just throw out these kind of terms instead of actually dealing with the problem, the real problem. So I think what you said, though, is great in that regard.
Okay, we've covered some of this, but I think this is important, especially if anybody's listening kind of from the other end. They're like, you guys, they feel like we're too extreme on the other side because maybe, you know, maybe it's accounts, maybe it's somebody listening right now that like knows a lot of people who have been true victims. So I think this is important. Let's talk for a few moments. What are some of the reasons why this language is dangerous? Why is therapy speak in everyday language out of context of a therapist dangerous?
Well, okay.
I was just going to say, I think it's, I'll say what I said earlier. I think we're just wielding tools we don't know how to wield. You know, like I don't know if you go around saying, well, you probably have, you know, coronary arthritis, you know, I don't know. We don't do that. That's the thing, coronary arthritis.
Coronary arthritis. Is that a thing?
No.
Okay.
But we don't do that,
Yeah.
right? We know I am not in a position to diagnose that. I'm not in a position to identify that. And I think a lot of us need to understand we're not in a position to identify some of these behaviors on our own without the help of a therapist. You know, one of the things in that article is leave therapy speech on the couch. I think there's many of us that need to do that because it is dangerous, because it almost can warp the way you even see your own reality.
Yes.
You can paint your own world with these.
There's the power of language.
The language you use will paint the reality you live in, right? And so if you have, oh, this person's a gaslighter, and this person was, I've experienced this trauma, I've experienced this. Eventually, whether or not it's true, it'll become your reality. And so I think for most of us, we need to just leave. It's almost like we've WebMD'd mental health a little bit. Yep, that's my symptoms. I've got that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we don't.
How about this one? It hurts real victims.
Yeah.
So maybe you might be a victim of abuse, and you're thinking, well, don't be hard on the word abuse. But I think one of the reasons that we're contending to use intentionality around these words is because there actually are real victims.
Yeah.
And the more you misuse, abuse, and overuse a word, the more the word loses meaning. You know, one of the connected to you're hurting real victims, I wrote this one down, loss of language. I was reminded of the C.S. Lewis quote. C.S. Lewis always warned us not to use words larger than the meaning because eventually we'll have no words to use. And so I think when we, what was it in that article? They talked about trauma. And I think the quote was, through an extended game, I thought it was an interesting phrase, through an extended game of telephone, trauma has lost the edge of its meaning. Here's another one I wrote. It broad brushes and dehumanizes people because there's no nuance. I'm going to quote this therapist from that Vox article. She said, there are gradations of the human experience, and therapy speak terms are often the most extreme ways of describing those experiences. A friend can be selfish and not a narcissist. You can feel stressed without experiencing trauma. A partner can lie without gaslighting. Instead, mental health professionals urge you should embrace nuance and avoid pathologizing normal, albeit annoying or painful behavior.
Yeah, I think that's so good, especially when it comes to teenagers. I mean, I see everything to a teenager produces anxiety. There is no, I just feel a little nervous. There's no, I feel nervous before a basketball game. No, it just makes me anxious. It gives me anxiety. We've lost like normal feelings in this somewhere. It is normal to feel nervous sometimes.
And okay.
It is normal to feel stressed when you've procrastinated your homework. That is normal. It's, school is just trauma.
School is trauma.
No, it's so good. You have any others?
What was the original question?
Why is it dangerous? What are the reasons that it's dangerous?
Well, okay. Besides the things you guys have already said, those are good. I think it's dangerous in the fact that a lot of times when we use those kind of terms, it's like dropping a bomb on your relationship. And so what I would say is that sometimes it's really hard to come back. Sometimes we're just angry in a moment and having a blow-up fight, an argument. And the moment you throw out, you're just abusive to me. Well, if they're not abusive to you, but you have labeled it, you may have just derailed any future hope of that relationship, because now there's going to be a fear in the back of the mind of that person that you're going to, accuse me of being abusive. Now, again, so I think, and again, there are situations where people are absolutely abusive.
Yes.
Usually the situations where people are really abusive, the person who feels like that they're the ones that are recipient of feeling it, usually will never call them out as being abusive because of what they would, you know what I mean?
Yes.
What they get. So I think that there's a danger for the relationship. I also think that, again, with us understanding that there has been a history, as long as there's been humanity, there has been an awful history of abuse and power and control and manipulation.
Yeah.
It's happened through the sexes, it's happened through the races, it's happened through, it's like we are not discrediting any of that or your experience. If you have experience, whether it's physical abuse or mental abuse, spiritual abuse, all of those forms of it. But that's the whole point of this conversation, is that the language of something that is extreme has become normalized to where it's really dangerous, I think, to drop those terms and that language on the impact, not only of the relationship, but what you are accusing of that person of.
Yeah.
There are some things in some roles, some positions that this may never be a legal matter, but just the accusation alone might be enough to destroy someone's life, their livelihood, their relationship at home. I mean, you could be at work and you say this particular person at work is abusive or is manipulating or is whatever. Again, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying we have to be really careful. And so that's why I liked what you said, which was just in that quote, leave the therapy language for the therapy. I think one of the reasons why sometimes we don't go to that point is because we don't have the vocabulary to often express how we feel. And I think a big part of us as a society maturing in this area is developing emotional intelligence. When you begin to understand, we did a book in our staff kind of been going through emotional intelligence, and there's a form in there that understands there's this many categories and all of these emotions, which is the gradation of your emotions, right? When you understand those things, what hopefully that can do is arm you with language to express how you really feel. Not, I just want this to stop, so I'm just going to say you're doing this. And so I think sometimes it's a lack of our emotional intelligence that often leads to using this kind of language in relationships. So.
No, I think that's so good. I think, the last one I put, because abuse would be the last thing I wrote down as far as danger is it doesn't deepen relationships, it damages them. But I don't think that's just the case in the extreme examples of when someone accuses you of abuse. I think in like your ongoing day-to-day relationships, like even something a little bit milder like gaslighting, I think what you said is so important because of lack of emotional awareness, emotional intelligence. I think let me say this. In relationships, I think code language is lazy language. And I think it is used more often to accuse than to resolve. And so, kind of going back to something I said earlier, and I'm not saying this is the right thing for everybody. For me, what I've just decided is, because I've, I don't know that I've ever been in a long-term relationship where I've felt whatever, but there's been a moment or two where I maybe if I went back and dissected, there was like a gaslight thing or whatever. But for right or wrong, better or worse, I've just decided that I'm never going to use those terms. But that if I'm feeling something, I'm going to, first of all, if I'm going to be in a relationship with somebody, whether friendship, romantic, whatever, I'm going to choose to trust first. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt until they've proven me otherwise. And giving them the benefit of the doubt, what I'm going to try to do is explain specifically, hey, you may not have meant this, but here's how I feel. And to me, if in relationships with each other, if we can avoid inflammatory language, to me, what I think these trigger words are is they're inflammatory language. If they're not true, they're inflaming and not healing. And so for me, I've just decided if I feel something, I'm just going to be very specific. I think the more specific you can be, as long as you're using a tone that could be reconciliatory, and that can be peaceful of, hey, like, I don't know if you realize, and be specific, when you did this, 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 and this. I think a great phrase in relationships is, hey, I don't think this is your heart, but for whatever reason, it made me feel this way. I think if we can do that and avoid inflammatory code language, it could actually lead to healing and actually lead to deeper relationships. Or maybe if you're in a relationship and you see red flag after pattern after pattern, then instead of just accusing and labeling, you just choose, you know what? I don't think me and this person are on the same page, so I'm just going to choose a different path.
Yep. That's a good point. That sometimes a relationship, not all relationships that end badly is because of some type of form of abuse or manipulation.
Yes.
That it just might be, it hasn't gone well. Every time you get together, you fight. Every time this, like do that. And so instead of just accusing them of something, and I'm not saying this, sometimes that doesn't happen, but just say it's good just to get that vocabulary out of your language. And to save that for, what I like to say is, and this was helpful for me, like I've gone through some experiences that created visceral reactions, that just in my journey in church leadership and other things, that I wouldn't have known what it was until talking with a counselor who's saying, that when your body was reacting like this and this, that's very common to a traumatic response. Okay. But I'm not going to sit there and compare what I did to go through. Oh, that's, I'm not going to sit there and go, I've just been traumatized by this. I let the therapist tell me, hey, that's a traumatic response out of this. Oh, I didn't realize that, And so I think it is, the best thing is leave the therapy speak in the room, the therapy room, on the couch, and try to learn to have a vocabulary, even if you can't. And it is hard, I think, in relationships, to just express how you feel.
Yes.
In that moment. Without turning it on that person and bailing on the conflict and blaming them for everything. And so it's so hard to talk about. I think one of the things we just, even as we close, I'm sure, but I think we all have, there's a trepidation that we have even in talking about this because we know there are so many real situations of abuse, manipulation. There are people who go through real trauma. I mean, we talk to people all the time that sometimes they tell your story and go, oh my gosh, that is trauma. Not my parents were really hard and made me go to church when I was a kid. Okay, that's not trauma. But I think we understand that. And so I think, just please hear us in our heart in this, as we aren't coming to this as experts. We have an understanding enough about this and conflict and human relationships, but we're just trying to throw on the table, let's just be careful of the language that we use and make sure that it's appropriate and make sure that we're not using tools that we aren't equipped to handle in situations.
Yeah, because I mean, ironically, I think I'm okay to say this because we've all talked about this publicly. All three of us have gone to therapists and counselors, and all three of us encourage people to do that.
Yeah.
So we're actually pro therapy, pro counseling, and pro getting the help that you need for whatever you're genuinely experiencing. And we will also be the first people, again, to weep for and fight for true victims, and to even just say on this podcast, if you're a victim of abuse right now, our words are get help, call someone, get out of any situation in which you're in danger. And if you're in truly toxic relationships, find healthy relationships. I think, but I do think it's a conversation worth having, because I think this out of context pop psychology, like you said, being wielded improperly is actually hurting our relationships, not making them better. And I think, back to your victim point, I think if we, by the language we choose, create a narrative in which we are even subtly always the victim, we actually begin to ruin our lives, and we lose power over our lives. The moment you're a victim is the moment you lose the power to change your life. The moment you lose the power to actually choose a different path. And so even if one day a therapist tells me that I am truly a victim, my goal is to never to stay a victim. But to choose the path of someone, whoever comes.
Good.
And so,
Good.
Any final words, Jesse James?
Nope. I think you nailed it.
No. I need a safe space from you sometimes.
Oh, we didn't even talk about that.
No.
On college campuses, safe places.
Safe spaces.
In other words, no one ever disagrees with your challenges, your point of view, or your...
Anyways.
Anyways.
Well, I think people might have some comments, and I think we're happy for people to share them. It's a conversation.
Absolutely.
We love to have people engage in it, and if you've got an experience or encounter in an environment that you've been a part of that is one of those in those categories, and you feel like sharing it, we love to get people's perspectives on it.
Yeah. And if you have questions, comments, or you disagree with us and you're like, hey, I see this differently, email us podcast@thex.church, podcast@thex.church. We're always here to engage. And the whole goal of these moments is just to elevate our thinking and elevate the way we engage with the world and each other. So thanks for tuning in. Until next week, we will see you then.